For years, IRGC fast boats had been swarming U.S. Navy vessels inside the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point just 21 miles wide at its narrowest, where roughly 1/5 of the world's daily oil supply has no other way out. Every time, Washington absorbed it. Then, in early 2026, something shifted, and the cost Iran paid for running that playbook one last time was nothing like it had calculated. To understand what the U.S. was actually up against, you have to understand how Iran's harassment campaign was built, because it was not improvised. It was engineered. The IRGC's fast boat doctrine exploited one specific geographic fact. The Strait of Hormuz narrows to roughly 21 miles at its tightest point, with only 2 navigable shipping lanes, each barely 2 miles wide. That geometry is not a minor detail. It means a vessel transiting the strait has almost no room to maneuver. A fast inshore attack craft capable of doing over 40 knots can close the distance from Iranian coastal waters to the center of a shipping lane in minutes. The IRGC's naval forces included fast inshore attack craft that repeatedly harassed U.S. naval vessels in the Gulf, along with several warships and at least one drone carrier. The swarm tactic was the point. A single fast boat is manageable. 13 of them, coming from multiple vectors inside a channel with no exit, forces a U.S. commander into a calculation that has no clean answer. Open fire and risk an international incident, or hold and signal that the threshold does not exist. That calculation had been tested before. In one documented encounter, 6 U.S. Navy vessels escorting the USS Georgia encountered 13 IRGC fast attack boats transiting the Strait of Hormuz, with the Iranian craft closing to within roughly 150 yards before warning shots were fired. 150 yards. That is the length of an American football field, between a guided missile submarine escort and a swarm of armed Iranian speedboats. The US fired warning shots. The Iranians left, and then the whole sequence repeated, because the IRGC had learned that warning shots were the ceiling, not the floor, of the American response. The drone and tanker harassment layer worked on the same logic, but aimed at a different target: the global shipping industry's risk tolerance. At least 9 to 15 tankers sustained damage since the conflict escalated, with documented losses including the Honduran-flagged Nova, struck by 2 drones and left burning in the strait, and the US-flagged Stina Imperative, which sustained aerial impacts that killed 1 worker. Each strike was a data point for insurance underwriters. War risk shipping insurance premiums surged to between 3% and 10% of hull value, up from roughly 0.25% before hostilities, meaning a $100 million tanker that once paid around $250,000 in war risk premiums was suddenly facing bills between $3 million and $10 million per transit. Iran did not need to sink every ship. It only needed to make the math prohibitive for enough operators that traffic thinned, pressure built on consuming nations, and Washington faced the political cost of a choke point it could not keep open. In March 2025, the IRGC announced the deployment of missile systems on 3 disputed Gulf islands, a move that extended Iran's layered threat architecture deeper into the strait's approach corridors and signaled that the escalation ladder still had rungs left to climb. The message was deliberate. Every rung Iran climbed without a decisive U.S. response confirmed the thesis that American rules of engagement had a hard ceiling, and that ceiling could be exploited indefinitely. That thesis had been correct for a long time. The pattern, provocation, warning shot, de-escalation, repeat, had held across years of encounters. Analysts watching the campaign noted Iran's strategy was designed to maintain pressure while signaling control, keeping the confrontation calibrated just below the threshold that would force a qualitatively different American response. The IRGC was not trying to win a naval battle. It was running an attrition campaign against American credibility, betting that the cost of sustained presence would eventually outweigh the political will to maintain it. What Iran did not account for was that the United States had already decided to stop absorbing the cost. Iran ran that warning shot playbook for years because it worked. So would you have held the same ceiling or pushed back harder the first time they closed to 150 yards? Drop your answer in the comments below, because what Washington quietly decided next is where this story takes a very different turn. What changed that playbook was not a single warning shot fired back. It was a decision, made in Washington and executed by U.S. Central Command, to stop treating the strait as a place to absorb pressure and start treating it as a target environment. On the 19th of March 2026, the United States began an aerial campaign against Iranian targets specifically to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. That date matters. It was not a retaliatory strike in the traditional sense, a one-night response calibrated to send a message and then stop. The operation was announced as a plan to reopen the passage to international shipping by destroying Iranian naval vessels and drones targeting shipping in the strait. The objective was not signaling, it was dismantlement. U.S. Central Command reported striking Iranian air defense systems, command and control networks, coastal radar sites, anti-ship missile capabilities, and more than 60 IRGC small boats in and near the strait to degrade Iran's ability to continue attacking international commerce. 60 boats in a single reported action. That number is the argument. The IRGC's entire fast boat doctrine, the swarm geometry, the multi-vector approach, the compressed reaction windows it had spent years engineering, depended on mass. Take enough of that mass off the board, and the math that made the swarm dangerous stops working. One CENTCOM strike alone hit approximately 80 Iranian military targets, including more than 60 IRGC boats. The U.S. military said the operation was intended to impose heavy costs on Iran for violating the ceasefire by attacking 3 commercial vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. Each Iranian provocation was now generating a documented asymmetric response, not a warning shot, but a subtraction. The IRGC's command structure took a direct hit at the same time. Israel assassinated Alireza Tangzuri, the naval officer overseeing the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Removing the operational commander of the Strait blockade mid-campaign does not just create a leadership vacuum, it severs the coordination layer between the fast boat units, the coastal missile batteries, and the drone launch sites. The swarm tactic requires real-time command synchronization. Without it, the individual components are dangerous but no longer a unified threat architecture. Iran's response confirmed that the pressure was landing. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard stated that the strait will not be open to the enemies of this nation through the ridiculous spectacle by the President of the United States. That is the language of a force that has run out of operational answers and is performing defiance for a domestic audience. Regimes that are winning do not issue statements like that. The economic dimension closed the remaining exits. The U.S. naval blockade imposed on the 13th of April 2026 was costing Iran an estimated $500 million daily, according to U.S. figures, with 85 vessels intercepted by CENTCOM. Iran's ability to replace fast boats, replenish drone stockpiles, and sustain the logistics of a prolonged strait campaign all ran through oil revenue. Cut the revenue, and the attrition the U.S. was inflicting on the fleet could not be reversed. Until the conflict, the Strait of Hormuz had carried roughly 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade and 20% of its liquefied natural gas. That is the scale of what Iran had threatened to hold hostage, and what the U.S. campaign was methodically working to restore. A sustained closure of that choke point would not have been a regional energy disruption. It would have been a global one, touching fuel prices from Tokyo to São Paulo. Iran's conventional Navy warships were largely destroyed, but analysts noted that its true sea power had never rested there. The country's ability to credibly threaten commercial ships through the strait hinged on multiple layers of cheap and unconventional systems, drones, mines, and small attack boats harder to detect than traditional naval assets. That is the honest counter-argument, and it is real. The Mosquito fleet was not fully eliminated, and the threat was not reduced to zero. But a threat architecture is not just about what assets survive. It is about whether those assets can be coordinated, commanded, resupplied, and deployed with enough mass to force the calculation Iran needed to force. By mid-2026, each of those conditions had been systematically degraded. Iran spent years betting that the warning shot ceiling was permanent, that America's rules of engagement had a hard upper limit it would never cross. What it did not account for was that the ceiling was a policy choice, not a physical constraint. When Washington changed the policy, the entire strategic logic Iran had built the campaign around collapsed with it. Iran had challenged the most powerful navy on Earth inside the world's most critical choke point, and it lost more than a confrontation. It lost the credible threat that had been its only leverage. Subscribe for more breakdowns like this, and watch the next video on screen to see what Iran's collapse in the strait means for the wider Gulf.